everyone, or good afternoon now. Had a good break. All right, so we've talked about, Uri introduced us to the concept of API-led connectivity, why it's important, how it's going to help your enterprise take its game to the next level through becoming a composable enterprise. We talked about this notion of experience APIs, process APIs, system APIs, and some of the principles, the architectural principles that you would want to follow to kind of get to that sort of end state. We've had a couple of great presentations from Arsenal and Siemens about sort of how their businesses are getting transformed and how they're using connectivity as a strategy to help enable this transformation. And so what I wanted to talk to you about is, I wanted to talk to you about the journey to get there. And so, the business model transformation that all of you in your companies are experiencing coming from a variety of industry forces, right? So what you're going through today, if you're in the insurance industry, it's about how do I keep my customer close? How do I minimize all the risks associated to my business? How do I make sure that the way we're operating is in a way that's prudent for the customer, but prudent for making sure that we're also managing the risk in my company through innovative ways, right? So that's, if you're an insurance company, that's what you're thinking about. If you're in financial services, it's all about the digital bank. It's all about how do I cater to this new mode of customer interactivity, B2B customer, B2C customer. It's about being able to digitally provide a new muscle so that you can serve your customers, as well as making sure you're secure, you're managing your risk and your compliance and all that good stuff, right? And payments is a huge thing with banks as well. How do you make sure that you're able to keep up with the new payment mechanisms that are out there? If you're in the retail industry or consumer packaged goods, it's about the omnichannel. It's about new sort of ways of understanding how consumers can be served through a much more contextual way. How are we going to be able to serve a consumer by knowing what they've done, what they've purchased, and how they're going to now behave? It's all about getting closer to the consumer and making sure that they're loyal to your brand, making sure that there's an innovation layer in your own company to make sure you're keeping up with that sort of fickleness that a consumer has nowadays. If you're in healthcare, it's all about redefining how you're going to now manage this new customer and doctor, nurse, provider relationship. How, as a hospital or as a provider, are you going to redefine your operations to make sure you're ready for this new kind of landscape? And what kind of ecosystem partners are you now going to have? So this is very key. If you're in the media industry, it's all about, it's the digitization of content, not only around dissemination of content, but aggregation of content. So how are you going to now receive content and give content in a way that is much more contextual, in a way that is much more customer-centric, but also how are you going to make sure that you're continuing to make money and staying relevant by offering innovative kind of platforms for you and your advertisers to coexist well? In the energy industry, it's all about, customer centricity. It's all about, smart grids, smart meters. We already heard about that a little bit. It's all around connected customers. It's around the redefinition of new standards that are emerging that are now going to redefine how you work. Things around clean emissions, things around localized energy production, things like that. So in all these industries, and forgive me if I missed some other industries we're in, but what we're seeing in the customer base that we have is, business transformation is a very key element that we're trying to enable, the outcomes that we're trying to enable, and these are some of the outcomes that we're seeing. So we have a bunch of industry forces, but what I really want to focus on today is talking about how do you get there. So, the operating model that needs to transform is key. It's all about technology, absolutely, but it's also about the processes that you have to imbibe. It's the people, okay, that's my boundary. So it's about the people, it's around people and process. It's around how you operate, how you actually literally go and do business. So let's talk about that for a second, right? And how do you actually paint this picture? Well, let's start from what Uri mentioned in the beginning. So fundamental kind of problem that we're solving is, from a technical perspective, is we're exposing assets, digital assets, to different audiences, right? And so Uri talked about this notion of APIs, different ways to go about APIs. Great. Now, what does this mean in terms of how you now operate? It's very interesting, right? Because on the very top spectrum, you'll have rapid, agile practices, people that are building mobile apps, people that are working on 2-week, agile Scrum timelines. But at the very lowest end of the stack, it's still very legacy, very monolithic in nature, very much around, centric, change management centric, release management processes, ITIL, ITSM centric processes, right? So how many of you have, all these big processes in your company? Just raise your hand. Pretty much 99% of the audience, right? Except for that one person in a startup. So this is the key, is how do you manage this emerging spectrum that's coming up? And so it really is an emerging spectrum, because what's happening is that there is no definitive kind of layer that you can say, we're going to operate in this spectrum like this, and we're going to operate in this spectrum like this. It really is a spectrum, a smorgasbord of a mix of practices, a mix of cultural transformation. And so the key in my mind is, well, how do you actually start to qualify and quantify what this spectrum looks like? What this, the folks that are at the very top, how they're operating, how do you actually qualify that and quantify that? And then how do you compare that to the folks that are at the very bottom? And so I wanted to just give you a very quick framework, things that we're seeing in some of the leading customers that MuleSoft works with, that we're seeing as ways to kind of latch onto some definitive drivers and definitive kind of quantifiable ways for you to look at this, right? So one is looking at agile and lean practices, DevOps, platforms, infrastructure platforms, the way you're looking at teams and culture, and the way you're looking at governance, right? So I just wanted to take you through a little journey, a little step-by-step journey of each one of these facets. So the first thing, agile and lean practices. So this is a very obvious thing. A lot of people that have read, Lean Enterprise or books like that, it's all about, being very quick. And so what we see is that in the top layers of the spectrum, we'll see a lot of agile practices, a lot of continuous integration, continuous deployment practices, especially in the edges where there's, aggressive mobile app development or very aggressive timelines that need to be met. But of course, we still have the other world. That's not going away anytime soon of, traditional waterfall-like practices and the governance procedures around that. And so the key is, how do you kind of differentiate between both of those, right? And how do you kind of understand how to cooperate in those two worlds? Because you're moving from a world on the left-hand side, in some cases, where now you had requirements kind of over, and definition of a project over a 6-month, 9-month timeline. And how do you actually now move to a model where you're actually saying, the requirements are not going to be in a 90-page BRD. They're actually going to be in one single sentence. As a role, I want to do this so that I can get that. That is a requirement in terms of like behavioral-driven design. And so how do you actually move to that sort of a requirement model, and how do you actually now chop it up so that you're actually pushing to production very regularly? And that's part of the key part of agile development and agile practices is, you're using behavioral-driven development and test-driven design principles in addition to continuous integration, continuous deployment to kind of inform how you quickly go to market with products in a very agile manner. And key to this is making sure you're thinking in terms of product. You're thinking in terms of everything you're doing is product, is a product with a consumer, a product with a market. Is this thing going to be relevant? Is this thing going to have a consumer? Am I making it with a consumer in mind? But let's not forget where we came from, right? This is actually happening. This is still happening, and it's going to happen. We still have these kinds of initiatives. So raise your hand if this is sort of what's happening in your enterprise. A good amount of you, right? But, raise your hand if this is what's happening in your enterprise as well. Yeah, exactly. So there is a mix. There is no one size fits all. There's a spectrum of things emerging where you're actually going to have a little bit of everything across the spectrum. And so the key is, some questions to ask yourself is, well, first of all, where are agile practices kind of, being employed, and how can I actually figure out areas of opportunity to actually make sure we're innovating at scale really quickly, or innovating really quickly in certain business units for certain initiatives, and what are the roadblocks for us to get there? Because you know what? It's all about making sure you're taking a customer-centric mindset and treating things as products. And then you know what? How do we bridge between this slower world and this faster world? What does that look like in terms of a process? The change management processes, the ITIL, ITSM-centric release management processes, and all that kind of stuff that are here, how do we kind of blend that and make sure it works well with the agile landscape over here? And so some of these considerations should not be overlooked. These are key questions to ask yourselves as you go about becoming an API-led connected enterprise. Second thing is this, DevOps. So